So there is this growing concept of having shock responsive social protection systems in place, which can be scaled up and scaled back in the event of a disaster. There are various issues to consider here, I think, and in a country like Malawi, there's already a question mark over the extent to which the humanitarian response each year is in fact emergency response, and to what extent it's responding to chronic poverty and problems that arise year in, year out at the same time of the year. And I think that calls into question the whole issue of having shock responsive social protection, needing to be able to scale it up, recognizing where the funding should come from to meet those different requirements that people may have going from one year to another. So there are different models which are talked about. One is vertical expansion, which is providing more substantial transfers to people who are already part of a program. Another one is horizontal expansion, where you're in fact increasing the number of beneficiaries of a particular program in response to a disaster. There's the idea of piggybacking, where you're essentially trying to build your humanitarian response on top of an existing program. And then there is another approach which is called shadow alignment. But I think all of these things really amount to the same thing. What's important is two aspects. The first one is to have systems in place. If you have good systems in place for monitoring what happens to money, for registering your beneficiaries, for delivering cash through electronic payment, for example, for making people aware of what's available, so information, education, communications campaigns, for people to appeal against abuse of the system. All of these things will serve just as usefully in a humanitarian response as they will in your standard social protection. So those systems are really important. And that's one of the things we're trying to help to build in Malawi. The other really important question of linking the two things is to look at the funding, because an awful lot of funding goes into humanitarian response. And it's a very inefficient way of providing the funding for what is essentially a chronic problem. It would be much better to use that funding up front to build better resilience, to have better social protections in place, and thereby to reduce the number of people who require humanitarian assistance when an inevitable shock occurs. Yes, social protection is much more about politics than it is about economics. That's the first thing to understand. So what matters is a government's attitude to its citizens. And I think we see two very different models that have emerged around the world. In some cases, we see countries developing very tightly poverty-targeted programs which try to identify the poorest 10% of a population and provide assistance through social protection systems to that core group. We see other countries which have adopted a more universal approach and have decided on particularly vulnerable categories of the population and provide a more universal benefit to those individuals. And I think it is interesting to see how those different programs evolve. If we take Malawi on the one hand and Lesotho on the other hand, we see a dramatic difference. They both established social protection programs at around the same time, 10, 12 years ago. They were responding in both cases to the ravages of HIV and AIDS and the problem of missing middle households where grandparents were taking care of grandchildren. And in both cases, they decided to start a social transfer program. What we saw was that in Malawi, they developed a poverty-targeted program targeting those most labor-constrained households. In other words, the one where there weren't the missing middle parents. And that program has scaled up. It's been successful in that it's scaled up. It now covers the whole country. But the value of the transfer has remained almost identical. So in real terms, it's actually slightly decreased over the 10 years. Lesotho chose to go down a different route and paid a old age pension to every citizen over the age of 70. And the interesting thing about that is because everybody was receiving it, it became a huge political issue. There was political debate at every election. The amount was raised after every incoming government. And we've seen a big difference, so that now in Lesotho, the value of that pension over the 10 years has increased by fourfold. And the difference there is purely the political economy. Now, you can't just change from one to the other. It comes from government. But I think there are more and more lessons from around the world that in many ways this universal approach is one to adopt. I think in most developing countries it's important to envisage a multi-channel system. It's not going to be possible to provide electronic payments to absolutely everybody, but there are certainly a number of beneficiaries for whom that would be a big benefit. So we're beginning to see payments through banks, through mobile phones. All of these are viable and all have many advantages in terms of security, in terms of efficiency of delivery, but there is also some losses along the way, because one of the advantages of bringing people together to a pay point at a particular time is that it gives you an opportunity to provide messaging, to provide information to groups of people, and for those people to build a network amongst themselves. So a group of people in similar circumstances may be building some community cohesion between themselves. Those tend to be lost if you move towards individual electronic payments.